It's my great pleasure now to introduce, for some closing remarks, my friend and colleague Seth Brueggemann, who is a historian at Temple University, where he is director of the Center for Public History. His most recent work is the edited volume Born in the USA, Birth and Communication in American Public Memory, which we just read in my public history class, so thank you, Seth. He's also the author of Here George Washington Was Born, Memory, Material Culture, and the Public History of a National Monument. Seth has his PhD in American Studies from the College of William and Mary. He has the maybe unenviable task of summing up things for us today. He's been following the Twitter reports from our group discussions. But the topic we've asked him to address to close our thoughts is history as a pillar of civic life. So please welcome Seth Brueggemann.
Thank you so much, Charlene. Boy, I hate to become so formal in the midst of such a fun, informal conversation, but that's my job. In fact, I've been given two jobs today. The first is to summarize what we've been talking about, which is, it's making me a bit dizzy. I've been following the Twitter feed as you all are talking, and I maybe got through 5 of them out of who knows how many. So anyway, but I'll try to do that. My second job is to inspire all of you with a call to action. And I think you're already pretty well inspired, quite frankly. So I don't know that I can do much better at what we've already achieved, but I'll give it a shot and see where we go. First, let me say, by way of some introduction, that I do the things that Charlene mentioned. So I run a public history program. I write histories. I do scholarly things and whatnot. But I'm also a longtime friend of the National Park Service, and it goes back a pretty long way, for me at least. Probably about 15 years ago, I had my first exposure with by working with the Historic American Engineering Record. And then since then, periodic encounters through writing administrative history, doing scholars visits, this, that, and the other thing. So this is my way of saying that my comments today really filtered through the lens of a few different perspectives. I want to talk to you as a person who does history within a university, but I also want to talk to you as somebody who teaches people to be public historians. And hopefully in some cases maybe even find jobs with the National Park Service. And I also want to talk to you as somebody who just loves the parks and who wants his young daughter, who's only 2 now, to also love the parks after she's simply content to play in mud puddles and run through the woods and whatnot. At some point I'd really like her to have the opportunity to be inspired by them in the same way that I have been. So there's some framework with you, and I should also say that it's really fun to be here and see a lot of people that I've worked with in the past, some that I've never met in person, but just by email. And I also say that it's an incredible honor to hear Pat West say anything nice about my scholarship, because if there is a public history historiography as such, her book was really what turned me on to it and inspired me in the first place to do much of what I've done. So it's nice to be in the company of such smart people. So how to make sense of all this? Let me just start by trying to talk about some of the tweets. This is part of my job. I don't know how to synthesize tweets, and it's probably, it's a terribly analog thing for a speaker to try to synthesize tweets. So you should go do it by yourself with your smartphones or computers later on. But a couple interesting trends. Just a few notes that caught my eye. One person asked, boy, why is there so little diversity in this room? Somebody else asked, how do we go about creating advocates for the Park Service? Somebody asked about the role of passion. How does passion play in what we do within the agency? What did I write here? Somebody talked about how to create better communications within the agency and beyond its borders. There's some interesting comments about NPS trading cards. I guess, which I love, which is a great idea and I want to know more about. What interests me about all these is that they're questions. right? And I've been involved in a couple events like this, including one at the National Council of Public History meeting in April with some colleagues from Parks Canada. We wanted to talk about Imperiled Promise and its potential for implementation in an international context. And we had that same phenomenon where we asked a lot of questions and got a lot of questions. And this is a good thing, right? That's how conversation works. Although, on one hand, events like this, we'd love for them to produce some answers so we can go back to wherever we work and implement those things. So questions begetting questions, a good thing. It begins conversation. Another point to make is that these questions that we're getting in our Twitter feed are not terribly unlike those that, again, I've experienced elsewhere, especially that wonderfully hard question about diversity, right? Looking around the room, seeing a lot of white folks dressed well in a comfortable room. That's a common experience in these sorts of venues. Raises even more questions, right? How do we get the audience to look different? How do we have a conversation with people we're not apt to meet in our usual day-to-day world? If we talk about community engagement and take it seriously, why don't we have a bunch of rabble-rousers in the back of the room who are the community, who can keep us honest, right? So a lot of wonderful tweets encouraging us to think critically about not only Imperiled Promise, the report, but also our practice, to be reflexive about how we talk about what we do. So but that's just the tip of the iceberg. A lot more smart stuff going on in the Twitterverse, I think Christine said. So go visit it and see what you think. Let me move beyond tweets for a moment and say a few things about themes that emerged in our earlier conversations from our speakers and that resonate powerfully, I think, with Imperiled Promise, the report, the joint NPS-OEH report. I've really been sort of doing this on my feet, so bear with me a little bit because I'm thinking out loud and trying to play some ideas off you and see where they go. But I did hear several powerful themes from our earlier presentations I want to talk about a bit. And the first has to do with, again, what I think Christine referred to as this need within the NPS to deconstruct expertise, which is a really nice phrase. In the world of academic public history, we talk about shared authority, Michael Frisch's term for redistributing authority. But this is taking out the world of the theoretical and putting it into the world of the practical. I think what we're talking about here, a desire that's coming out of the report and that was voiced by this morning's speakers, is an interest in breaking down institutional and intellectual silos, right? Getting back to the problem of the separation between history and interpretation within the agency. Breaking apart fundamental knowledge structures that have given shape to the agency's historical work over the long run. This is a really familiar conversation to me as a university academic. It's something that we are talking a lot about in the university. In fact, I want to share quickly an experience I had last night with one of our participants, Mary Rizzo. I don't know where she is. Hey, Mary. So Mary and I and a number of other people who were identified as public historians were invited to Princeton University to talk about public history. Princeton recently discovered this new thing called public history and was looking for some experts to clarify what it meant. And so we eagerly joined them to have that conversation. And what became apparent after a few minutes of conversation, there are a number of, sorry, finding a place for my water. There are a number of graduate students there who wanted to hear about how we came to our work. And they asked us about our backgrounds. And we went around the group and talked about our studies. And I talked about studying American Studies in grad school. Mary talked about studying American Studies in grad school. At least one other person talked about their American Studies background. And at some point, a student, Mary said this to me this morning, at some point a student said, "So is it okay to study history if you want to be a public historian?" And in a way, it was sort of the perfect question, right? And we got to talking about this a little bit, and we started realizing that, and this is dovetails nicely with Wayne's comments earlier, that so many of us who are running public history programs or have found success in the field have come at it from places that aren't properly historical in definition. And that says something. I think it raises an issue that is significant within the world of academic history right now. How do we define our knowledge structures? What do you need to know to do this stuff well? Who is our audience? How do we reach them? And what should our skill sets be? We're talking about that within the academy. You're all talking about it too within the agency. And that's why I'm so incredibly excited to hear, for instance, Luann talk about these academies, right, that are being developed to engage core questions about institutional history, about how the agency works, about what knowledge is. It's wonderful stuff, very exciting. It also frustrates me a little bit too, because I hear these descriptions of these courses and I think, I want to teach those courses. Come to me at Temple and let's do this. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that the academy and the agency have somewhat parallel histories and very similar concerns, and we've not always been so good at talking with one another for important reasons. You read Denise Marengolo's new book about this, and it's really illuminating. But we can help one another, right? And I think the time is right, especially because of the so-called crisis in humanities. The time is right for you all to come colonize us and take over the university and tell us how we are going to restructure our history departments and other humanities departments. This doesn't simply need to be a conversation about history. National Park Service could be well served, I think, by thinking about public humanities as a model for doing interpretive work. But come tell us how to do our stuff and take advantage of our own crisis, and I will be happy to develop curriculum with you. So one point I want to make. A second point or theme that came out of this morning's conversations gets us back to this issue of institutional history, which again, I'm indebted to Pat West for getting me to think about the importance of doing this, thinking about institutional history. It seems to me that Imperiled Promise points us in a direction, and I think I read you all right when I say this, where the National Park Service feels like it's time for its staff to think hard about institutional history and grapple with it and include it within its own professional training. I love this idea. I want to expand it, though, because it seems to me that the conversation today was really about regional staff, people already doing history in places of power or influence, and how it gets done. But I want everybody in the National Park Service to understand its institutional history. And when I say everybody, I mean everybody from whoever is working in the back rooms, doing basic services, doing maintenance, up to people who are actually involved in policy making. And I say this for a couple reasons. I mentioned, I think, that I wrote an administrative history some years ago, and it was of the George Washington birthplace. And one of the most surprising facets of that process for me was doing oral histories with staff at the park who I discovered had absolutely no idea how their colleagues function within the context of the agency or the park. And we're often really pissed off at one another about things that seem to be really based on absolute misunderstandings. And it occurred to me that boy, what if everybody had a primer in how their colleagues did their work, or how the agency worked, or whatnot. So my sense is that I like this conversation a great deal. I want it expanded. I want it to empower NPS staff at all levels to respond to the inane spectacle we just saw of Congress attacking the National Park Service for not doing its job in the midst of a governmental shutdown. How do you respond to that effectively unless you understand how your agency works, a little bit about its history? We actually saw some really amazing examples of frontline folks doing that, right? And they were exciting and got me riled up. I want everybody to have those tools. I think it's absolutely necessary. That's where the passion comes in, right? That people were tweeting about that I mentioned earlier on. So the second that was my second observation. Third, and perhaps this is a corollary, but I think I see this emerging out of the conversations this morning and being discussed in Imperiled Promise. it's important for NPS staffers to understand their institutional history, but it's also important for park users to understand it, right? And this is, this gets us into the realm of discussing reflexivity and parks looking in the mirror, talking about themselves with and for their various audiences. And it used to be, several years back that as soon as I would mention this possibility, I'd get beat up all over the place and get lots of pushback from within the park and elsewhere, which is why I'm so excited to see Imperiled Promise, because it makes me feel like my job is, like I can go away now. The argument for reflexivity has been made so well, you don't need me around. But again, I'm looking for a broader vision, and thinking about recent events in Valley Forge specifically. I don't know how many of you were following the case of the Freedom Runs out of Valley Forge, joggers that were really irritated that they had been locked out of the park and were, I guess, jumping gates or whatever and running around as a patriotic statement, about what nasties the NPS are for keeping them out of the park. What a wrong-headed thing to do, if I understand what was going on there. But what a great potential moment. These are clearly people that have this kind of passion that Barbara was mentioning earlier about the place, right? Strong feelings about the place for reasons perhaps we don't necessarily anticipate as historians, but it doesn't matter, right? They're interested in the place. Wouldn't it be nicer if we could harness that passion in the service of the agency rather than in the service of fringe politics? I think that would be great. Therein comes that role for advocacy that, again, emerged in the tweets. And I think we can use Imperiled Promise to begin talking about in some important ways. So those are some key themes. And in this way, I simply want to restate what so many people have said here and elsewhere about how significant the report is. It does a lot of things really well, including articulating that very complicated relationship between history and interpretation. And I love the report for that reason. As I said to somebody before, now I don't have to write that 5 or 6 or 7 paragraphs or chapter and whatever next thing I write about the Park Service. Somebody's already done it, and it's eloquent and powerful. The report, though, is also interesting in other ways. It's been really important to me in one way that I'll share with you, and that is it's helped me answer a question that so many of my students have asked me over the years, which is, why don't you work for the National Park Service? You love the National Park Service, you keep writing about it, why don't you just get a job there? And honestly, I haven't really had a good answer for that question until I read the report. And quite frankly, I was always a little bit upset about the fact that nobody was encouraging me to, hey, try out for this job, or there's a career for you in the agency, or and I thought, boy, they must really hate my work, or me, or some combination. And maybe that's the case, I don't know. But what I've learned from the report is that there are sort of deep-rooted systemic problems that have made it very difficult for the history program to be what it can be, and to have the kind of self-determination that I think it needs and wants. And that's been really refreshing and has helped me feel a little better about myself, and makes me, again, think that this is a problem of folks outside the agency not understanding how it works inside, right? The report can bring that institutional, or it can show us ways to bring that institutional profile and history to a larger audience. Why is that important? Let me make one more argument for why it is important to think about institutional history and reflexivity in engaging not only agency staffers, but the public too. So spring 2012, I taught a course at Temple concerning the history of the National Park Service. And I hope this gets offered regularly for a long time. It's part of Temple's Pro Ranger program with the National Park Service. Pro Ranger program it helps train undergraduates for careers in law enforcement within the agency. It's a brilliant program. I want it to be bigger and better funded and more wonderful. So I do anything I can do to help with that. And so I suggested at some point to the coordinator that hey, how about I teach a history of the National Park Service? I do write about it, after all. I'm not an expert. You all here are much smarter about it than I am, I'm sure, but I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to talk about potential law enforcement, or to talk with potential law enforcement rangers about why it is they've come to be able to have that position. What is the agency? What's the relationship to it? What does it do? Who ultimately are they serving in that position? So I taught this course. It was a blast. It was a lot of fun. Probably the best thing about it was, when I say 2012, this was spring 2013. Yeah. The best thing about it was the timing, spring 2013, because if you remember, we were surrounded by media coverage of the impending budget sequestration. And that, I guess, hit in March, is thereabouts, which kind of worked very nicely within my, terrible for you all, wonderful teaching moment for me. So I exploited it as much as I could. But what was absolutely astounding, so I guess the decision was made, I came in, I wanted to talk about sequestration with my students, and so I asked, okay, so somebody tell me about sequestration, how it's going to impact the Park Service. There are about 30 people in this class. A small portion were per ranger folks, probably just about a half dozen. A lot of interested undergrads from other majors. Maybe one person had any sense of what sequestration meant. And when I say any sense, I mean the vaguest sense, like, is it related to the government? Is it bad? Extremely, extremely vague sense. And I mean, I'm often surprised by what my students do and do not know. And my reason for bringing this up is not to critique them so much, but rather to say that this is a real problem for the agency, right? It's not just a problem of young people not being aware of current events. It's a problem of young people not understanding the basics about how the federal government works, about what a federal agency does, how it relates to how local units relate to larger federal units. Really, sort of basic problems with understanding how money, support, and the electoral process works in the governmental level. It occurred to me that this was, I'm not saying that these people are a perfect sample of Americans, but if they're even a slightly imperfect example, it means that the challenge to make advocates of visitors is a massive one. And it's got to begin, it's got to grow really in all levels, in all units, be done all the time. And especially with regard to training people to work in the agency. I mean, it occurred to me that the fact that the Pro Ranger folks weren't a little more tuned into this meant that, we were maybe showing, we were focusing on teaching students how to work in the National Park Service, but we weren't doing so good at showing them how the NPS works. And my hope is that these academies that we've heard about are going to address those issues, and I think they will. The good news is, though, by the end of that class, these students were pretty excited about the National Park Service, and I would even say approaching impassioned in some cases. And so I asked them, at the end of the class, in retrospect, why they thought the NPS was significant. And this was my tricky way of kind of harvesting arguments for that moment when I came face to face with the congressman who yelled at me about not funding the agency. And what they ended up saying to me was pretty interesting. And I am paraphrasing, but essentially they said they were excited about the Park Service because it seemed to them the last great hope for something that looks like, for lack of better words, a kind of positive nationalism, right? A way for Americans to connect with the nation that wasn't inspired by fear, say terror or an external enemy, or disaster, right? But simply because the nation is great, for reasons that our parks make evident. And they were very clear to me too, though, that they were really burnt out on patriotism. And this is the sort of post 9/11 generation. They wanted a point of access to the nation but they wanted it to be something that was flexible, fluid, and open to critique. That's a fairly sophisticated statement, I think, and a pretty good goal, I would suggest, for the agency as it thinks about what its history program can provide within the units moving forward. How you do that is another question. Imperial Promise certainly points in some productive directions, and conversations like this help us along that path. Thanks so much for letting me talk with you.